All right, I'm back. This is the beginning of the second half of chapter one. I want to assure you that the lectures, video lectures, will not always be this long. It's these first two chapters are extremely dense. They're crucially important to understanding the rest of the term, and so generally there'll just be one lecture, and if there's a second, it won't be as long as this one will be. So you're not going to have to sit and watch for as long as you will this week and possibly next week for the rest of the term. So, what I want to do now is start with one of the most important, if not the most important, thinkers and theorists of his time, our time, all time, and certainly sociology, his contributions to sociology, and that's Karl Marx. So he was a German social philosopher. He was often described, as your text says, as the most influential social scientist who ever lived. So you can see that I am not exaggerating when I said the things I just said about him. And he lived at a time when the Industrial Revolution was starting, and he was seeing these huge changes that were occurring in society during that time when people who had been fairly independent and self-sufficient in terms of raising their own food. They were craftspeople who primarily bartered, but sometimes sold what they made, and lived in the more rural areas. And with industrialization, they moved en masse to the cities. The cities weren't ready for that. There was no plumbing, no running water, nothing. And so it was a social revolution as well as an economic revolution. It was a social revolution, and it was people were in pretty bad shape, and the working conditions were horrible, etc. So he was observing all of this as a brilliant social philosopher. So what he was doing was he explained the social changes that were taking place during the Industrial Revolution. That began in England around 1780 with the invention of the steam engine, and it spread to Europe and the U.S. in the early 19th century. So it that invention of the steam engine, which was originally utilized in the textile industry, which was a huge industry in England, uh, the first machinery, if you want to call it that, to be uh, created was with engine energy rather steam energy rather than human energy were the large looms, the industrial looms in the weaving and then industry, and then huge factories were built to house those huge looms. So what happened was that large scale manufacturing occurred within a very short period of time. And when things like that revolutionary happen in a very short period of time, as I said, the systems don't keep up with the social systems, the actual physical systems in terms of housing and plumbing and that type of thing. Nothing kept up. So this extensive mechanization that occurred during the Industrial Revolution created the shift, as I said earlier, from agriculture and home-based production into masses migrating to cities to work in these god-awful factories for 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that created rapid urbanization, as I just said, which the cities were not prepared for. The infrastructure wasn't there. So he saw all of this, and he saw that the source of all of these huge transformations and transitions that were not beneficial to human life, was capitalism. So he, in observing this, it was the development of capitalism, said economic issues produce division rather than social solidarity. He saw the value of social solidarity and everybody kind of being in it together as well. And he said what he sees with this capitalism and the emphasis on just money and the people who own the means of production, which we'll talk about in a moment, as destroying social solidarity. So capitalism, and what was the most important change was with capitalism is that the ownership of the means of production is in private hands. That's the definition, the characteristic of capitalism. The result was that it created three social classes. And so the first was the capitalists, and they were the owners of the means of production, is a terminology that is used, the ruling elite, and they own, as I said, the means of production. They own the factories, they own the machines, and those are what is producing the wealth for them. And today we could say the tech companies, think Jeff Bezos, and I know that's not, I guess that is a tech company in a sense, but whatever. You get my point. Okay. So there's the guys at the top. They were all guys who owned all the factories, who said, you're going to work this many hours for this pittance of a pay, whatever, in these horrible conditions. Then there was the petty bourgeois. The petty bourgeois were the small business owners. There were still small business owners. And some people who owned the small businesses still worked in those small businesses, or they hired people to work in those small businesses. And they have their own means of production, but it's very fragile because they can be driven. They're small businesses. Think of all the small businesses that were put out of business by the big box stores in our times. And you get an idea of what was happening during the Industrial Revolution. Only it was very extreme. So they're small business owners, and they're making some money, what we would call maybe middle class, lower middle class, but they're on the edge all the time because their business can die at any moment through competition with these large people. And then when their business fails, they go out of business, they become part of the proletariat. So there's basically two major social classes from a Marxian analysis: the capitalists and what's called the proletariat. In the middle are a small percentage of people that are the petty bourgeois, the small shop owners and things. The proletariat are the masses of workers who depend on wages to survive. We have this today, right? And they have very few resources, and they make up what's called the working class. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this situation where people work for minimum wage. It's a ridiculous amount to sell your life for, but what choice do you have? And this whole argument over $15 is, even that is barely making it. So that's what Marx saw a long time ago. He saw where this was all going. What he said was, of course, that this huge discrepancy between the haves, very few, and the percentage-wise, and the have-nots creates what he called class conflict. So it's a society divided into that, the haves and the have-nots, the capitalists and the proletariats or workers. So therefore, class conflict is virtually inevitable in a capitalist society from his perspective. And that way, it creates a society that is not cohesive. It does not have social solidarity. Class conflicts between capitalists improving their profits by exploiting workers and workers resisting, but they give in because they have no choice. Okay? So that's another aspect of what happens that creates conflict. You don't want to work for what is the minimum wage in some southern states is like $3, less than $3 an hour. So you don't want to sell your life for $3 an hour, but you got to eat, and so do your kids, you know. So that sets up a system where there's a lot of conflict. And then another aspect of his analysis is that there's a very close relationship between inequality, social conflict, and social class. And yes, that is a fact. That is a social fact, that there, where you find this huge amount of inequality, you find social conflict and social and the existence of social class. And that history, he said, Marx said, is a series of class struggles between capitalists and workers since the Industrial Revolution, that the history since then. As wealth becomes more concentrated at the top among the few, Marx predicted that the ranks, this huge mass of dissatisfied workers, would lead to a revolution, which would eventually lead to a classless society. Well, we've seen that two times in relatively modern history, the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution. It actually occurred first in France with the French Revolution. That was a bit earlier. The problem, of course, is that the system that replaces the terrible system is often also a terrible system. And he did not anticipate that. I think that he thought that the workers would have kind of learned a lesson about having haves and have-nots, and oppression and that type of thing. But absolute power corrupts absolutely, apparently, even if you've been a worker in a previous, life. So one of the ways, and it's never happened in America, people have been kind of waiting for people to get angry enough to have a bloodless revolution, because we can, because we're a democracy, because we can vote, right? So, but we also have a very broken political system, as we know. So we did see an example of this in the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011. There's a box on page 10 of your book. There are also some wonderful documentaries about the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it did prove at that time, many people thought that was going to be the shift in America when we moved to a more egalitarian system of social support and economic support in terms of wages for workers, but it kind of fizzled out. But it was based on the growing inequality, how angry people were about the growing economic inequality in America. So all of this stuff leads to what Marx termed alienation, a feeling of being separated from one's group or society. And that can begin with one's work life, for sure. A lot of these very, 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 very angry people in America right now are angry because they feel alienated from their society. It's not what they recognize. It's not working for them. And how you view that, who you blame, are different issues. But a lot of what's going on is based on alienation. So workers get alienated within a setting, and I don't know if any of you are old enough to have worked in a situation where you have these feelings, but certainly anybody who's worked for any length of time in their life has. So workers are alienated because they don't control either the means of production or what's being produced, right? You have no input into that. I love this statement. Meaningful labor is what makes us human. That's from your text. I call it mastery. If you're not doing something in your life, no matter what it is, that you have some mastery over and pride in doing, and you're contributing on some level, and I'm preaching this to you because you have to make choices about your future, what academics you're going to take to lead to that future, et cetera, et cetera. Um, that's what makes us human. Okay. It doesn't have to be anything glorified at all, but there has to be something that's meaningful that you're doing with your time and your energy, and in exchange for your labor. That's the key point here. Uh, so what Marx said was that being alienated from your work, whatever that is being alienated from the essence of our humanness. So instead of collaboration, society encourages competition. We know this. It starts very early on, looking out for number one rather than being. And this is what's so beautiful about unions. Let me tell you. Been in the union a very long time at SWAC. People who belong to unions call each other brother and sister when we get emails. Um, you know, um, that's how we refer to each other. There's certainly it's fraternal. In fact, some unions are called fraternal orders, right? So there you go. It's pretty powerful. There's collaboration rather than competition. Rather than looking out for number one, you're looking out for the whole group. So that creates social solidarity. So I'm going to tell you an Intel story. A friend of mine, this was years ago, lives in Portland. Was in the tech industry, and the job she had with the company she had, AT&T, she had to travel a lot, and she decided she didn't want to do that. She had kids, and she wanted to stay in Portland, and so she applied for a job at Intel, big tech company. She got it, and she lasted there about 6 months. And she told me this story. They had a big meeting with some of the top salespeople, which is what she was, and I can't remember his name, but the guy who owned Intel, the CEO, said in his spiel to them, which is basically go out there and sell, and compete with each other for sales. He said, "You want a friend? Get a dog. This workplace is not a place, you know, to have friends." I was really amazed when she told me that, and she was too. She quit shortly thereafter. So that's alienation, folks, from each other and from the work that you're doing. So, but Marx pointed out something very, very interesting. He said, "Hey, the capitalists are also alienated. That they're alienated from their products too. Their goods and services are only important because of profit, right? So look at I forget the name of that family that has just had to pay millions and millions of dollars and possibly go to jail because of the opioid epidemic. They knew, they knew the whole time how addictive opioids were. They did all kinds of encouraging things to get doctors to prescribe them when they weren't necessary. Think about the cigarette industry. They knew, they lied about their research that this is many years ago, that nicotine caused cancer. Smoking cigarettes causes cancer. They knew that. Okay, it was very clear. There's plenty of other things about. Well, anyway, we don't need to go into all of those aspects. Some of those things come up in different chapters, by the way. Things with tires that killed people and the Pinto and all of that. It was pure. If it's purely about money, then even the owners of the means of production, from a Marxian perspective, are alienated from the humanness of producing something of worth or value. Okay. Obviously, this is one of my major themes. I find it just so important. And that people aren't conscious of this so much. It's important in your life to find something that you feel that way about. So as the text goes on, like even the capitalists are alienated. They're not connected to their products. They don't care who buys or sells them. They don't care how the workers feel about making them or the conditions in which they make them. Or whether they're valued by buyers, as long as they're still buying them, and the major focus for the capitalists is primarily on increasing profits. And then you get into, here's the examples, the car recalls, toy recalls, pharmaceuticals that cause harm, et cetera, et cetera. So that's Marx's analysis of how this all is working. Now, Max Weber, it looks like Max Weber, but it's pronounced Max Weber, German, 1854 to 1920. He was a sociologist, an economist, a legal scholar, historian, politician, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. Unlike Marx's emphasis on economics as the basis of society, Weber focused more on social organization. He was looking more at that. Marx and Weber come up in every chapter there because their theories are involved in everything we study. So what he meant by social organization was the economics was important, yes, but it was equally important. He agreed with Marx that economics were crucial. They were a crucial institution and aspect of society, but so were ideas, religious values. He worked a lot with religion and religious values, you see as we move through. Ideologies, charismatic leaders. Who were the charismatic leaders? Those were all crucial to shaping and changing societies. Let's go back to charismatic leaders, for example, for just a moment. Think about a society whose charismatic leader is Hitler and a society whose charismatic leader is John F. Kennedy. Very different societies with very different results and ways of being in a society. So he said that a complete understanding of societies requires the analysis of their social organization and the interrelationship of economic, political, and cultural institutions. He wanted to include it all. And he wrote a very influential and powerful book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He saw capitalism deriving from what is called the Protestant work ethic. And we're going to talk more about this. I don't have the time right now to delve into it in depth. But that whole Protestant Calvinist self-denial, he said, that supported the rise of capitalism, and it shaped many current values about, working hard, nose to the grindstone, but you don't buy yourself anything good. That's what capitalism is. You take your profits and you reinvest your profits, your capital, in the business, in whatever it is you're producing, which grows the business. If you spend it all on yourself, now once you get to the level of, millionaires and billionaires, of course you spend a ton on yourself. But he was saying that the rise of capitalism, how it developed, came out of this Protestant religion, specifically Catholicism. Calvinism, John Calvin, which was very self-abnegating. You couldn't wear anything fancy. You couldn't have a fancy house. You couldn't spend money on yourself. That was pride. So what do you do with the money you're making if you're working so hard? You reinvest it in the business. That grows the business. You make more money, et cetera, et cetera. So he also talked about having a subjective understanding of what was going on. I mentioned this term earlier in the first lecture, in the very beginning, Verstehen. Verstehen means knowing how people perceive the world in which they live. If you can begin to do that once again, you will begin to understand so much more deeply the divisions of people in our country today and how some people perceive the world in which they live so strongly one way and some people perceive it in a completely different way. So he said that there were two types, okay? And you can read about that. One of the thing that he really talked about a lot was value-free sociology, and there's a box on page 11 to look at that, where you separate one's personal values, opinions, and ideology and beliefs from scientific research. And you'll see when the discussion of that, can sociologists really be value-free? It's virtually impossible to do that. You're always going to bring that stuff with you, that, I was going to say baggage, but it's really not. It can be big time, baggage, but it doesn't have to be if you're a self-aware person, your personal values, opinions, ideology, and belief. But it is important to stand aside from them when you're doing scientific research as much as possible to recognize where they're influencing you. Is a kind of a was a controversial view during Weber's time because the government and other organizations demanded that universities teach the right ideas, right? That you had to completely follow the norms of the society and the religious institutions and political institutions of the time. So it was kind of radical in his time to say, wait, you got to stand back from all of that. And so what Weber wanted, what he hoped was uh, that educators and scholars would be as dispassionate as possible, uh, politically and ideologically. That they would be able to, as much as possible, set aside their personal stuff and just look at the facts, at the research. And there's that box I told you about to check. Now, once again, that's a great uh, theory, impossible to do completely. And then there's a whole discussion about, wait a minute, if you learn something that's messed up in society and by changing a law or changing a system, you could improve people's lives dramatically. Shouldn't you do it, even if it's something you believe strongly in? So that box will help you figure all of that out. So now we're going to look at Jane Addams real quickly, 1860 to 1935. She was a social worker, a founder of Hull House, which is the first settlement house in Chicago. And that those settlement houses were built to serve the waves of immigrants that were coming into the U.S. to get them kind of set up and acclimated to America and what was expected, and teach English and education for children, and teach about nutrition and I was going to say sanitation. That's not the word I'm thinking of, but you get what I'm trying to say. She was. It's interesting because Hull House, her settlement house, was very near the University of Chicago, and even today, people go who are sociology majors at the University of Chicago, which was the first sociology department in the United States and is still one of the very best. And they do field work in places that Jane Addams set up, but she was never allowed to be part of the university or in the university. She was a reformer, feminist, into women's suffrage, right to vote. She was the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and as one other modern sociologist said, the greatest sociologist of her day, although she was never a sociologist, right? But she was ignored by the sociology department at the University of Chicago. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Black sociologist, 1868 to 1963. He was a writer, a reformer, PhD in sociology, and orator. Wrote a couple of books about African Americans. And he spent most of his life responding to critics of Black life. And he wrote about Black life. So it got out there, and then there was all this criticism about it. He was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. And he said, I was in Harvard, but not of it. And he was a founder of the NAACP, the National Association of Colored People. He very clearly and consistently in his speaking and writing stated that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Boy, are we reaping that today, never dealing with that either, and seeing the truth of that statement that he made over and over. He believed that the race problem, as he called it, was one of ignorance, and that the cure for that, if it's a problem of ignorance, well, then the cure is one of knowledge and information. It's one of the reasons I love teaching sociology and anthropology, because there is an emphasis on issues of prejudice, discrimination, diversity, and that type of thing. So it's let's get with the knowledge and the information, right? He said also that it was important to promote Black political power and civil rights in higher education rather than channeling Black students into technical schools, which is very common. Of course, his ideas were very unpopular at the time. For one thing, he was kind of the Malcolm X to Martin Luther King in his day. I mean, he wasn't as radical as Malcolm X, I guess, but it's a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, because Booker T. Washington was much more acceptable to white people because he encouraged Black people to be patient instead of demanding equal rights, which is the opposite of what W.B. Du Bois was doing. And so the result was that Du Bois was dismissed as a radical, but then he was rediscovered by a generation of Black scholars in the 1970s and 80s. And so he's taught now all the time and is very well accepted. Here's the key. All of those people, those wonderful thinkers and philosophers that we just talked about in the first lecture and this lecture, all of them agreed that people are transformed by each other's actions, social patterns, and historical changes. So all of us, this is the thing that I think is hardest for students to get who have not thought about this all previously. We are all at the affect, really, right, of each other's actions, social patterns, and historical changes. You cannot fight the historical changes. They are going to impact you. Other people's social actions are going to impact you to one degree or another. Now, we're seeing this all played out very dramatically and intensely today, recently, I should say, but it's always there. It's always there. So contemporary, and let's look at the contemporary social theories now that developed out of all these people that we've talked about, the founders. There, and as I said, there's usually only 3, but this textbook covers 4, okay? And they're macro and micro. Functional, conflict, and feminist are all macro. They look at institutions, they look at the big picture. Symbolic interactionism, which we'll get to last, looks at the smaller picture. It looks at beliefs, values, communication, body language, presentation of self. I mentioned all that. So, functionalism, it's also called structural functionism. I like the term structural because you understand there, as well as functionalism. Let's think about a building, okay? You see the building's the function, right? It's an office building or it's a college, whatever. But it isn't the walls that you see that are holding up the building, is it? That it's the support of the building. It's the structure. It's the beams and the posts and all of those things that are under the walls that are holding it up. So that's what structural functionalism is talking about, are those things that hold a society together or hold it up. So it's a system, it's a complex system from a structural functionalist perspective of interdependent parts, and they work together to make a hopefully functional society, okay, to ensure survival. I want to give you a Mobile example. John Bradshaw, I don't know if you probably don't know who he is. He was an older guy and he's dead now, but he was a therapist. He worked with addiction stuff. And there's a lot of videos. You can look him up and you can actually see him work with the Mobile if you look up the videos on YouTube. John Bradshaw is his name. He used a Mobile as an example when he was talking about dysfunctional families. And what he would say sometimes is that, they come and they say, my my husband's an alcoholic, or my daughter's impossible, she's acting out all the time, fix her, to the therapist. And what he would say is, often a family will pick out the person that is the acting out person in the family, the bad person, the person that needs to be fixed, the person that needs therapy. But he used a mobile as an example of the family. You know what a mobile is? Hanging with little things that dangle off and they all balance when it's still. But he would push one piece of the mobile and the whole mobile shifts, doesn't it? When the wind comes, the whole mobile shifts. You can't just do one thing to one part of a mobile and not have the whole thing shift and move. And so his analogy to the family was, hey, you got to fix, it's a family issue. You got to fix the whole family dynamic, not the identified patient in the family or bad person. And that's kind of what the structural functionalist perspective is with society. All the pieces work together, hopefully functionally, all the structures, to make for a good society. These interdependent parts work together. Uh, so, so you see society as a social system, and each institution or social group has structures. It could be government, religion, education, medicine, the family, etc., that all work together. And most of them function together um, to survive, kind of like body organs. They keep the large system working by working together. Um, so but there's also dysfunctions. DYS always means something that is against whatever the rest of the word is. So a dysfunction. So slavery, for example, was a dysfunction. Um, on the other hand, you could say, well, slavery was very functional. It certainly worked for the people who were not slaves, because to get free lifelong labor from somebody and to have them be of value that you could sell them if you needed to for a profit is very functional for those folks, right? The owners. But it's very dysfunctional for the slaves. And ultimately, it's dysfunctional for the whole society. We are still reaping, of course, the consequences of that system. So there are dysfunctions as well as functions, two things. If you think about religion, it serves many valid functions, but some of the dysfunctions are the horrible religious wars and Protestants burning Catholics at the stakes, and then that's the stake, and then vice versa, later. And so you get the point. It's important to understand the different functions. So there are manifest functions, which are the stated functions. Okay. What's the stated function of education? To transmit in the educational system when you went to school. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. I meant grammar school. Okay. Transmit knowledge, right? Okay, that's the manifest function. But latent functions, latent means hidden or not seen, but present. Those are purposes and activities that you don't necessarily see. They're not overtly transmitted, right? But they're very present, and often they're very powerful. So if you ask somebody what they remember about grammar school, it's usually not learning to read, write, and compute. It's more often about how hall culture worked, how the little charts by the front door of the classroom, the door of the classroom, about the golden stars for the good students and then kids with none, and how people were lined up, girls versus boys. Those are all latent functions that taught us certain things. So manifest functions stated, latent are ones that exist but are not expressed, and then dysfunctions are ones that are social patterns that have very negative impacts on a group or society. I use slavery as an example. Okay. So I love their examples of, I'm going to run out of time if I'm not careful here, but I think it's such a great example of manifest and latent functions that they use marriage. The manifest functions of a marriage ceremony is to publicize the formation of a new family unit and to legitimize sexual intercourse and childbirth. Now, that's not so true today, but it certainly was the basis of marriage ceremonies ages ago. But the latent functions are as they point out, are like hands off. This guy's mine. This woman's mine, um, and and it is very clearly making family boundaries. Another one I want to add, originally the latent function, but we still do it as a custom, is it tells you that this woman now, instead of belonging to her father, belongs to the man she's marrying. Think about this. Who walks you down the aisle? Traditionally, your father. Okay. And he literally gives you a way, that's the term we use, to your future husband. Now, when you walk down the aisle, you typically had your father's last name. And when you marry your fiance, your husband to be, waiting for you there, when your father puts your hand in his hand, you have his last name now. Last names, historically, surnames were who you belong to for women. So there's another latent function you might want to think about in marriage ceremony. So what's some of the analysis, the critical evaluation of the functionalist theory? Well, what I call it is the don't worry, be happy theory. And that's the problem with functionalists. Oh, everything works together ultimately to make a stable society, and if you took sociology from the beginning up through the 1950s, most of your professors would be structural functionalists, right? And that would be what they would be telling you, is that, yeah, there's problems, but basically it all works, together to create social cohesion and social stability. But after, starting in the 1960s, now most sociologists are conflict theorists. And of course, you use all of the theories. They all have the valid aspects to them. But in general, most modern sociologists are conflict theorists, which we'll get into now, okay? Which is another macro theory, looking at large institutions. Based on Karl Marx's work, primarily, conflict theorists, and it examines how and why groups disagree, struggle over power, compete for scarce resources like money, like housing, like healthcare, like higher ed, et cetera, et cetera. Why some groups thrive in the same society that others can barely survive. That's the level of analysis of a conflict theory. And the sources of conflict were predicted, as we talked about, by both Karl Marx and W.B. Du Bois. Okay? So since the 1960s, as I said, and especially the feminist minority scholars, see that the key aspects of what's going on in society are the inequality of the sources of economic inequality and create conflict. That's why it's called conflict theory. And they agree also that many of the social arrangements are functional. As I said, the functionalists have something to contribute. But they ask who benefits from those arrangements and who loses. So that's another question to always ask yourself about things when they come up. Who benefits? And then conversely, who loses? Okay. For example, when corporations merge, okay, there are usually huge layoffs. It's usually the poorest paid, the people that are most in a most fragile economic survival situation who are laid off. And often the CEOs get huge bonuses for mergers. Well, they're laying off all these people that are not going to be able to make it. Conflict theories address social inequality too. That society is, what they're saying is, hey, society is not so cooperative and harmonious. Rather, it's a system of widespread inequality, which is kind of irrefutable in our modern society. And that there's continuous tension between the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are often children, women, minorities, people with low incomes, and the poor. Also, they study, conflict theorists, how those in power dominate political and economic decision making, which is so true, and how that group in particular controls many institutions in society. The critical evaluation of conflict theory is that some people say that it overemphasizes conflict and competition at the expense of social solidarity. Now, the feminist theories, which, as I said, are part of conflict theories in most textbooks, just it rolled into them. They pull them out in this textbook in every chapter to analyze whatever we're reading. Point out that they are examining just particularly and especially women's economic and political, social, economic, and political inequality. The early sociologists were primary male, so as we saw, so much of the theories that developed were based on a male perspective. And males in universities, and women couldn't even go to college for a very long time in America. And then there were specific teachers and nurses, that type of thing. Anyway, as feminists point out, that in men's universities and stuff, the academics were blind to the importance of gender. They just didn't even see the importance of gender. So until feminist activism in the late 60s and 70s, then it changed a little bit. It began to change. So feminist scholars agree with conflict scholars, as I said, but they go further in that they focus on, as I said, on what the systems are, how they affect women. Okay, so women often experience discrimination just because they're women, right, rather than because of personal inadequacies. Um, Feminist scholars assert that people should be treated fairly regardless of their sex, but they also focus on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, etc. And they also say very strongly that women should be freed from the traditional oppressive expectations, constraints, roles, and behaviors. Women are supposed to be nice, and if you get angry, you're a what, and on and on and on, those types of things. So they focus on gender. Now, because of feminist scholars, many researchers, male and female, they routinely include gender and the different effects, depending on what gender you are, different situations have for people. And most people, including some Muslim countries, support gender equality. There was just another recent study that say that people do, and that women should be able to work outside the home. But still, when jobs are scarce, most people, let's just take America, say that men should, keep their jobs and women should be laid off. The irony of that is, of course, that a huge percentage of American children are living in single parent families, the vast majority of whom are headed by women. So it's an old idea to lay off women because their jobs are just secondary jobs in a marriage that one can do without, when a huge, as I won't say it again, but a large majority of children live in single parent families headed by women where there are not two incomes. Okay, so the other point about feminist theory is that you want to listen to many voices, that the gender inequality is central to all behavior, from the micro to the macro, from everyday behavior to, economic and political issues. And you can read the three different perspectives, the liberal, radical, and global feminism in the text. I'm not going to take the time right now. The critical evaluation of feminism is that now they've created an old girl network and only talk to each other, basically. It isn't always open to different points of view. There's a lot of criticism about it being, especially the original women's movement in the 60s, white, educated upper class women, and did not address issues that were relevant to African American women and Latino and Hispanic women, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. And then let's look at the symbolic interactionist perspective in this last few minutes. I'm going to have to rush. That's the only micro level perspective. It examines people's everyday behavior through communication, through knowledge, ideas, beliefs, and attitudes. And it focuses on process with the person at the center of the analysis. It's the only one that really looks at individual stuff more. And we're going to talk more about who those sociologists were, who did that, who developed the theories in later chapters. So we'll get there. But the whole point is about meaning and constructing meaning. So from a symbolic interactionist perspective, our actions are based on social meaning, which is a process in which people take each other into account in their own behavior. So we act differently with different people, right? You act differently in a classroom than you do in the dorms. You even dress differently, you speak differently. We do that all the time, differently in our workplace than we do at home. You get the point. A variety of ways that we behave that are, as you'll see when we get into it, roles that we play. That idea of playing roles in dramaturgy is part of symbolic interactionism. So the idea here too, another idea of this is that society is socially constructed through human interpretation, that the meanings of things are not inherent, like part of natural DNA, whatever. They are created by human beings. The ideas that we have about how society should be, how we should act, how they're created and modified through through people's interactions with each other constantly. And we're going to get into this much more deeply in other chapters, as I said. So symbols and shared meaning. Symbols are huge in symbolic interactionism. Think of the term symbolic interaction. So we communicate through symbols. Language is a symboling is made up of symbols, right? When I say pen, the word pen doesn't, a pen doesn't pop out of my mouth. The word pen in English, we know what it means. If it's Spanish, it's la pluma. In other languages, it's other words, but the word is just a symbol for an object. So language is our primary way of using symbols. Think about flags. We displayed a lot of flags in America after 9/11, American flags, right? And rightly so. But many Muslim countries also burned American flags after 9/11. Two same symbol, very different meanings. Okay, so to work in a society, symbols have to have shared meanings and agreed upon definitions to be effective. So one of the most important is the definition of the situation. And I put a big wow and exclamation points after that. One of the most important shared meanings, I'm going to reiterate this, is the definition of the situation. That says it all for today, for what's happening. Two very opposing definitions of the situation. You cannot have a cohesive society when there are that many people who disagree about the definition of the situation, the way we perceive reality and react to it. That's the definition of the situation, the way we perceive reality and react to it. So we usually learn those definitions from the people who raised us and other significant others in our lives. Okay, It can be friends, relatives, teachers, pastors, priests, whatever. They're all, and now the internet. And I would have to add, unfortunately, to that. I know most of you wouldn't agree with me, but well, the internet can be wonderful. I mean, I certainly use it for things. I guess what I'm talking about is social media. Critical evaluation of symbolic interactionism. The most common one is that interactionists are overlooking, the macro factors, but that's not what they're addressing. They're not looking at politics and economics and that type of thing. So that's it. I will see you next week.